Once we've created a piece that we're ready to cut on the CNC router, we're done the CAD side of things, and we're ready to move into the CAM. That's the computer assisted manufacturing. And this is where we create the set of instructions that whatever device is going to help us manufacture the part will make it. In the case of this particular assignment, we're interested in using the CNC router, and those use typically a file type called GCODE. And that's what I've got pulled up here actually for a sample part. I created a bunch of toolpaths and generated a file, a .nc file, and this is G-code that our CNC router can read natively. So we basically will import this, and it's a series of instructions. We're not going to go into exactly what's going on in this file, but instead the steps that it takes to make it. But if you take a look at it, probably you can take a guess about what some of these instructions are. Like a lot of them have an X and a Y coordinate. Some of them have an X and a Y and a Z coordinate. And these are just like positions that it's moving the milling bit to carve that larger shape. Now let's take a look at how we can create this. I've got Inventor open and an assembly with actually a model of our carve build platform. This is not strictly necessary, but I think it's a great visual aid for creating the setup and creating the toolpaths, and we can see where exactly it's going to be fit, and we can visualize where am I going to be able to clamp this so that I'm not going to cut through my clamps, and is it going to fit, and those sorts of things. Now for this quick example, I've also modeled the stock that we're going to work with. So this is the piece of material that's going to be milled away. In this case, I've taken basically the maximum dimensions our CNC router can use, which is 12 inches wide and 8 inches tall, and this is going to be like MDF stock, 1/4 inch, which when I used the calipers to measure it was just slightly less than 1/4 inch. If I pick this edge, you can see I've got 0.243 inches in height, and you may want to double check that to make sure that your piece has that same dimension, but it should be something that's probably a little bit less than 1/4 inch. And I've also modeled just the piece that I want to cut out of that stock. So here, with that same sort of thickness, it's going to be 2.43 thick. This is one of the panels of my edge-lit acrylic sign that I'm planning on cutting out. And we can see that it's got a little bit of an interesting contour that needs to be cut out with some finger joints along the bottom, and a rectangular slot cut through it, as well as 2 rectangular channels that are going to allow some pieces to slide in. This is a back panel. There'll be a front panel that kind of matches with it. And so what we want to do is basically take this and be able to cut it out. So we're going to take a look at how we can create what we call a setup and then those tool paths. If we go back to our carve assembly, before I can create a setup, I want to bring in the stock and the part that I'm going to be carving into it. And we can actually carve more than one part at a time, but we'll just do a single part here just for simplicity's sake. So I'm going to press place. I've copied the location that my files are at, so I'm just going to jump to that quickly, and I'm going to bring in my 8x12 MDF stock, and I want to make sure that I orient it in a similar fashion as the board is, right? So I need to rotate it around the y-axis, and then I'll just place it and say OK. And right now this is just kind of floating up in the air. I want to use some constraints to both have it attached to the build platform and be square to these corner pieces here. So I've got 3 constraints to put in here. So I'll constrain the bottom of the board with the top of the build platform, and then I'm going to constrain this left face with the matching corner bracket. Hit apply. Now you can see it's sort of like overlapped the area that I want it to be on. So I'm going to get out of that constrained section just so I can move it. And we can see that I can only move it around along this axis because I've constrained it in 2 dimensions, right? It has to be on the platform, and it has to be in line with this edge bracket. So now that I've moved it and exposed sort of this left face and this bottom bracket face, I can constrain the 2 together, and we'll have like fully constrained our piece of stock. Let apply where we would want it to be. Right now, if I try to move the stock around, it's not going to let me move. It's fully constrained. Second thing we want to do is bring in the piece that we want to carve into it. So in this case, it's called back panel. Hit OK. And again, we want to make sure that the orientation matches. So for this one, I definitely want to rotate it so that it's flat, but I also want to make sure that the grooves that I'm going to cut into them, those channels, are facing up so that the milling bit can actually cut them. So I'm going to rotate around the x-axis, and you can see that those channels are actually facing down right now. So I'm going to actually rotate twice more around the x-axis. And now we've got those grooves facing up. And this is probably a fine orientation. Depending on how it's going to fit, I might spin more around the z-axis at this point. But I'm actually pretty happy with where this is going to be. So I'm going to click to place, right click and press OK. Now again, we've got this piece just kind of floating in the middle of nowhere. I want to be able to place it within this piece, and I want the top of this face to be in line, flush with the top of our stock. So I actually just need one constraint. Now in this one, instead of having a mating constraint where one face is going to flip and pair with the other face, I just want to choose a flush constraint, meaning that they're both going to face the same direction the way that they are, but they'll still be vertically in line with each other along the y-axis. So I'm going to click on the top face of this, and then I'm going to go down and click on the top face of this and hit apply. And with this kind of like pattern here, we can see that they're sort of occupying this same location, and Inventor's having a tough time deciding which face to show. And that's fine, but as we click and drag, we've got a pretty good idea about where this is sitting in the stock, right? And it's exactly flush with that top face, which is perfect. Now I want to stay away from this area because when the smart clamp is placed on, it occupies some of the stock right here, and we don't want the milling bit to touch that. That would be really bad. So we want to have sort of at least an inch each direction as a buffer. In this case, since I've got quite a bit of space to work with, I'm going to move up here just to stay well and clear away from this area. Okay, and that's looking pretty good. Now it's time to get into the cam side of things. We've got our assembly set up. The cam tab should show up if we've installed Inventor HSM on your computer. If this isn't showing up, just call me over and we'll get this plugin added. But when we switch to the cam tab, there's a whole bunch of things we can press on, but the very first thing we must do is create a setup. And so let's click on that. And this is going to add a cam tab here. And the setup is basically telling it like what are we carving and what are we carving into. Sort of the two main things. What is the model? What is the stock? And I'm actually going to flip over and I'm going to start with the stock. And now right now you can see that the stock, it thinks the stock, the thing we're carving, is the whole shape, a bounding box around the whole assembly, which isn't right. We want to just be carving our MDF piece. So I want to change from a relative size box to a from solid. If I click on this, it's activated this selection cursor, so I can click on something and say this is the stock that we're going to carve from. So I'm going to click on that MDF part, and that's actually all we sort of need to do in the stock tab. When we switch back to the setup tab, there's sort of two things we need to do. We're going to leave this as milling. In fact, this is the only thing that our router can do. We don't have a rotary attachment or something that's going to let us turn. This would be just for different types of machines. We just have a milling bit, so we'll always leave that as milling. We've got two things to set up. Basically, what is the coordinate system? And to do that, probably the easiest, and this is, so we're setting this coordinate system with respect to the thing that we're cutting. We want to pick the z-axis, so like basically the top plane, and as well as the x-axis. So if we click on this, we'll have two options. Pick the top plane, pick the x-axis. So if I just click on either of these things, that's for a z-axis, and you can see now that our z-axis will be perpendicular to that face, pointing straight up. And for the x-axis, I just want to click on one of these horizontal edges that would be in line with our horizontal dimension. Now in this case, if I look at my widget here, the z-axis is up. I want the x-axis moving to the right and the y-axis moving back, so I might just have to say flip x-axis. And now we've got sort of the orientation we want, up, left, and right. This will be easy to remember when we do the next step, which is to basically say where the starting lower left corner is on the stock. So if we click on stock box point, there's actually a bunch of black points that we can click on and say this is the lower left corner of the object. This is where we're going to start. This is where our home is. Now in the Carve, the home is in that lower left corner, right? This is where the smart sensor is. So we always want to click on this highest point in the lower left corner. And so basically the y-axis and the x-axis should coincide with those edges of the stock, and then the z-axis should be just that perpendicular vertical axis from there. And the third tab is post-processing. We don't need to set anything up there, so we can just hit OK, and we have a setup now. At this point, I can't see the model very well, so I would go back to my assembly model view. I'm just going to right click on my MDF piece and I'm going to toggle off the visibility. Right, so now I can see the part much more clearly, and when we click on the setup, you can see that it's showing us what the stock size is anyway, right? Even though I turn off the visibility, I've got this transparent overlay that's reminding me kind of this is where the solid material is. Next, we will create some toolpaths, which will basically give the set of instructions of how we want to cut this out and in what order.